Delgado for chairing this subcommittee and for his service to the country and to New York. And I'm delighted to be stepping into this role, even if briefly. And thank you all for joining me today in that first hearing as chair of the Commodity Exchanges, Energy, and Credit Subcommittee, and welcome to the hearing we're calling the Future of Digital Asset Regulation. Today's hearing is a good opportunity to engage market experts at the CFTC, digital asset stakeholders, trade in the derivatives and underlying spot markets, a primary access point for investors to the digital asset market. Digital assets are popular, very popular, but volatile, very volatile. We see this reflected in the substantial decrease in combined digital asset market capitalization from its peak of approximately $3 trillion in November of last year to its current levels of approximately $1 trillion. $3 trillion in November, $1 trillion today. Polling also reveals that approximately 20% of American adults have invested in, traded, or used cryptocurrencies. Providing congressional direction to establish the rules of the road to ensure American retail investors are informed and protected is as important as ever. While the CFTC has dutifully exercised its role as a regulator and enforcement authority in digital asset markets, its authority is not unlimited. Indeed, its authority is specifically limited. When you couple the recent volatility with high retail participation in digital asset spot markets, it is concerning that there is a gap in oversight and regulation of these markets. And it is that gap that we're particularly focused on. The growth of the digital asset industry has centered on innovation, transparency, and security. And I believe in fostering that innovation here in the United States. In contrast to a traditional bank or financial institution, the most popular cryptocurrencies, Bitcoin and Ether, have entirely public ledgers. Anyone can view them and participate in recording and authenticating transactions on them. As we will hear from our witnesses today, the digital asset economy presents opportunities to support financial inclusion. But without strong consumer protections and education and regulatory certainty, participants in the industry may be at increased risk of financial loss and exposure to fraud. Digital assets are complicated, and retail participants may be tempted by the promise of quick returns without knowing how the digital asset functions, or without knowing who received early access to information. Regulation regarding disclosure to market participants may help retail investors understand the volatility of the assets and facilitate smart digital entrepreneurship. But how we do that matters, and it may require new ways of thinking. Today's hearing will help this committee understand how congressional action, if done right, could give the CFTC the tools it needs to protect investors while fostering innovation here in the U.S. I'm especially focused on whether such action could be done in a fully bipartisan manner. Thank you again to the members and witnesses joining us today, as well as those who are following along online. I look forward to a productive conversation about the future of digital asset regulation. With that, I'm pleased to welcome the distinguished ranking member, Mrs. Fishbach from Minnesota, for any opening remarks she would like to give.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. And first of all, congratulations. And I'm looking forward to working with you. But more immediately, thank you very much for holding this important meeting. I think, and I appreciate your comments on bipartisan work. So thank you so much for that. And there's no better time than the present to discuss how and why we regulate financial markets and consider how to best balance the need to protect customers with desire to protect innovation. According to a recent survey, roughly half of American adults today own or have owned some sort of cryptocurrency. This brings digital assets on par with the number of Americans that own traditional securities. Of those Americans who own cryptocurrency, more than 74% bought them for the first time within the last 2 years. Since the creation of Bitcoin, thousands of cryptocurrency projects have been developed. Today, there are nearly 20,000 cryptocurrencies in existence spread across numerous blockchain platforms. Unfortunately, these tokens do not always fall neatly into our current financial regulatory framework. Traditionally, we protect investors through disclosure requirements and the segregation of their assets, and we promote market integrity through regulatory oversight and intermediaries and enforcement actions. But what rules apply depend on the nature of the asset and the specific types of risk market participants face. Regulations have struggled to provide guidance to market participants on how and when their activities require registration and compliance. Market participants still do not know what rules apply and when. Real risk to market participants exist, and we have an obligation to address them. Over the past several years, members of this committee have proposed legislation that would lay down clear parameters for the roles of both the SEC and the CFTC in digital asset markets. In April, Republican leader Thompson and Congressman Kahana introduced the Bipartisan Digital Commodity Exchange Act of 2022. The DCEA would give the CFTC, lots of initials today, expanded oversight of the trading of those digital assets, which are commodities. And it would bring certainty to market participants by doing what the regulators cannot, providing legal clarity to market intermediaries and participants. I appreciate the efforts of the CFTC and the SEC they have made to try to fold digital assets into existing framework. But in some cases, particularly for spot digital commodity transactions, the existing law simply lacks the authorities necessary. As the popularity of digital assets continues to grow, it is incumbent upon Congress to speak clearly about how best to regulate. I'm glad we have the opportunity to explore these issues and the way Congress can better create an environment where digital assets can become not only a valuable financial product, but an important conduit of innovation in our financial system. Thank you to each of our witnesses for their willingness to share their expertise with us, and I'm looking forward to hearing your perspective on how and why we regulate in financial markets, and where and when we might apply those lessons to the crypto markets and to the market participants. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I yield back.
I thank the ranking member, and also like to take this opportunity to recognize the leadership of Chairman David Scott on these issues. I don't see him present today, but we'll be happy to yield to him for any opening remarks should he join us, but I do note the presence of the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Thompson. I'd invite him to share any opening comments he may wish to make.
Well, thank you, Chairman. Let me start by echoing the remarks of our subcommittee ranking member and congratulating you in your new role with leading the SEEK subcommittee. I look forward to working with you. I know the digital assets have been an area of interest for you for several years now. As you know, the House Agriculture Committee has a long history of fostering technology and innovation. Leading on digital assets is no exception. Given the Commodities Future Trading Commission's role in regulated markets, the Agriculture Committee has an opportunity and responsibility to be at the table for these discussions. I appreciate you holding this hearing and your commitment to continuing the committee's education and examination of digital asset regulations and markets. As some may recall, this committee held one of the first congressional hearings to examine digital assets in 2018, which led to subsequent roundtables and conversations focused on how to regulate these novel assets. While these events provided ample education on blockchain and cryptocurrency, we still find ourselves debating foundational questions about how to integrate these markets into our financial system. Over the past month, the carnage in the digital assets has filled our news feeds. Prices have fallen dramatically, projects have imploded, customer funds have been lost or frozen, and billions of dollars in value have been lost. For those who have lost significant sums of money, this sell-off has been a catastrophe. And yet, the promise of cryptocurrency remains. Despite losses, the public's interest in this technology has not diminished. Developers and investors continue to build new projects and refine the technology, and this is why this hearing on regulation of digital assets is so timely. Clearly defined guardrails can provide more certainty to developers, investors, and the public. To provide these guardrails, I introduced H.R. 7614, the Digital Commodity Exchange Act, with Congressman Kahana. The DCA offers a framework to bring regulatory clarity to digital asset markets. This legislation protects market participants and builds on the successful system of principles-based regulation already in place at the CFTC. It establishes clear jurisdictional lines between financial regulators, helping to reduce regulatory complexity and clarify existing regulatory roles. And perhaps most importantly, it provides a clear pathway to compliance for those hoping to build the next great innovation with digital assets. The DCA will provide regulators with tools to hold bad actors accountable and help to protect market participants from fraud and market manipulation. Clearly defined core principles will also help establish a better understood and flexible framework to support the creation of new products and meet evolving market demands. Now, we don't yet know all the ways digital assets will be used, but that should excite us, not intimidate us. America has always been a leader in technological innovation and the spirit of entrepreneurship, and we should continue to embrace that spirit. Our committee must continue to put forward innovative ideas and sound proposals in these novel policy areas facing Congress. And I hope we can implement smart bipartisan solutions like the Digital Commodity Exchange Act together. And again, thank you to our panelists for being here today, and thank you for taking the time to come and educate us. I look forward to today's discussion. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Chair will request that other members submit their opening statements for the record so that we may proceed directly to witness testimony. Welcome, all of you. Our first witness today is Mr. Vincent McGonigal, the Director of the Division of Market Oversight at the Commodity Futures Trading Commission. Our second witness today is Dr. Christopher Brummer, Professor of Law at the Georgetown University Law Center. Our third witness is Mr. Jonathan Levin, the co-founder and Chief Strategy Officer of Chain Chainalysis. Am I saying that correctly? All right. Thank you.
Chainalysis.
Sorry. Chain analysis. Yeah. Okay, good. Let's get that right. And our fourth, and I mean, it's my first hearing. I don't want to screw it up. Yeah.
Great job.
Is it going all right? Is it going all right? Is it going all right? Okay, good. A lot of pressure up here. I've only been doing this for 10 years, starting to get the swing of it. Our fourth and final witness is Mr. Charles Hoskinson, the Chief Executive Officer and founder of Input Output Global. Thank you all for joining us today. We will now proceed to hearing your testimony. You'll have 5 minutes. The timer should be visible to y'all, so it'll count down to 0, at which point there is no time left. Mr. McGonigal, please begin when you're ready. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman Maloney, Ranking Member Fishbach, Ranking Member Thompson, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. My views are mine alone and do not reflect those of the Division of Market Oversight or the Commission. Cftc is the primary regulator of the futures and options market, and since 2010, the swaps market as well. The agency's mission is to promote the integrity, resilience, and vibrancy of the U.S. derivatives markets through sound regulation. We do that through a regulatory framework that seeks to ensure market integrity, protection of customer funds, avoid systemic risk, police derivatives markets for abuses, while fostering innovation and fair competition. A trading facility for market participants, including retail customers, interested in listing and trading futures must apply to the Commission to be designated as a contract market. That market must then comply with 23 statutory core principles. Those core principles require the market to ensure the protection of customer funds, protect market participants and the markets from abusive practices, and promote fair and equitable trading in the contract market. The contract market must be able to detect and prevent manipulation, price distortion, and disruption of the contract's cash settlement or delivery process. To comply with the system safeguards core principle, the market must establish and maintain a program to identify and to minimize sources of operational risk, including cybersecurity and disaster recovery. Designated contract markets are also self-regulatory organizations. That is, they must establish and maintain effective oversight programs, including monitoring and enforcing compliance with their rules. A market must submit to the Commission all new product terms and conditions which must meet certain core principles, including that the designated contract market only lists contracts that are not readily susceptible to manipulation. To ensure compliance with the core principles, CFTC staff conduct rule enforcement reviews, system safeguards examinations, and at any time, Commission staff may ask a designated contract market for a detailed justification of its continued compliance with core principles. And the CFTC also conducts direct surveillance on trading on those markets. Digital assets are commodities, and the CFTC has broad regulatory oversight over any derivatives products listed by designated contract markets. In December 2017, 3 designated contract markets self-certified that they would list Bitcoin derivatives contracts for trading. Today, 5 contract markets list for trading futures and options contracts on Bitcoin, Ether, or both of those products. The CFTC does not have regulatory authority over cash markets. We do have anti-fraud, false reporting, and anti-manipulation enforcement authority over commodity cash markets and interstate commerce. And since 2014, the CFTC has brought more than 50 enforcement actions involving digital assets. We filed numerous cases charging retail fraud, as well as charging platforms with illegally offering off-exchange trading in digital assets. In all, the CFTC has filed 25 enforcement actions that have included digital asset-related allegations in the past 18 months. Through the CFTC's extensive experience overseeing the trading of digital asset-based derivatives on CFTC-regulated exchanges, as well as our vigilant exercise of our enforcement authority, the CFTC has developed a keen understanding of digital assets and will continue to deliver on its commitment to protect customers to the fullest extent of its statutory authority. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before the subcommittee. I look forward to answering any questions you may have.
I thank the gentleman. Mr. Bremer, you may proceed when ready.
Subcommittee Chairman Delgado and Chairman Maloney, Ranking Member Fishback, and members of the subcommittee. It is a distinct pleasure to be here with you today. The Agriculture Committee is home to many of my favorite members of Congress, which is saying something for a law professor. If there is one thing I would like you to remember from my remarks today, is that the future of digital asset regulation will require much more than just placing various digital asset products into varying governmental organizational charts. It will also have to involve revisiting longstanding assumptions about market infrastructures and adapting the regulatory system in creative ways that reflect the best of our collective values and experience. As a securities law professor, I like to use disclosure as a simple example. All too often, carelessness, inaccuracies, and omissions in white papers, social media posts, and blogs have plagued the retail investor experience and welfare. Something I noted in my testimony on ICOs with their colleagues in the House Financial Services Committee 4 years ago, and something that's only been highlighted in the last several weeks as investors and consumers have too often been caught unaware of the risks entailed when transacting with opaque intermediaries. Yet deeming a digital asset a commodity or a security will not magically cure the problem. Commodities like gold, corn, and oil are subject to grading and quality requirements, but spot commodity transactions are not automatically subject to any particular disclosure regime. Meanwhile, calling a digital asset a security won't solve the problem either. U.S. securities law is simultaneously under and over-inclusive. It asks for disclosure on things like corporate board governance, but not blockchain governance. Furthermore, securities regulation is premised on the idea of disclosures being filed and not read, a posture that does little to help consumers and investors desperate for information as they navigate digital asset markets. So irrespective of which regulator is in charge, that regulator will have to have a builder's mentality. Strong and rigorous enforcement is essential, but it's just one tool, and by definition involves waiting for problems to arise instead of nipping them in the bud. You'll also need auditors of blockchain source code and better delivery systems for information and more. Now, with that said, there is the question for this subcommittee as to whether the CFTC in particular is up to the task of regulating the spot market for those digital assets, which are commodities and not securities. Fortunately, the United States enjoys not one but two world-class regulators, the SEC and the CFTC, and I do believe that both regulators could do the job, but each would bring to the table very different comparative advantages. The CFTC has a deep well of experience substantively regulating digital asset infrastructures, from approving the first Bitcoin swaps and options traded on exchanges in 2014 to overseeing the first U.S.-listed Bitcoin futures contract. Through its work, the CFTC has gained expertise overseeing the institutionalization of significant significant infrastructures intersecting directly with the digital asset commodity spot market, something the SEC has arguably only accomplished in attenuated fashion through Bitcoin futures ETFs. The CFTC is also an important cop on the beat of Bitcoin spot markets. So in many ways, extending oversight of cash digital asset commodity markets could be interpreted as a natural evolution or extension of its existing oversight. Where the CFTC is less developed than the SEC is in, however, the domain of disclosure. And the CFTC is also well behind the SEC in terms of resources. The CFTC is but a quarter the size of the SEC and enjoys a fraction of the SEC's budget. Where, however, I think the builder's mentality will be most critical for either agency will be in the context of financial inclusion. To its credit, the digital assets debate has opened up a long overdue dialogue on how overlooked communities, and especially minority communities, build wealth. But critics and proponents alike tend to miss the forest for the trees and dwell almost entirely on the wisdom of a particular asset class. Is Bitcoin good or bad for Black Americans, for example, without tackling the larger, thornier issue head on? How do we ensure communities traditionally left out of our capital markets participate in a meaningful and diversified way over the long term and earlier in a sector's life and economic cycle when value and wealth is created? Moreover, focusing on digital assets as an investment also diverts attention from what is likely the far more relevant question, at least from the standpoint of financial inclusion, namely whether there are parts of the ecosystem's technology stack that can be leveraged to open opportunities for the underserved here in the United States. And in my testimony, I list some of those potential use cases. So thank you very, very much for your time. I am really looking forward to this conversation, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thanks, gentlemen. Mr. Levin, you may begin.
Thank you.
And am I right, sir, that you're joining us from Australia?
I'm actually now in South Korea. I'm in Seoul.
South Korea.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for staying up late or getting up early. You may proceed.
Thank you, Chairman. Yeah, I like doing things for the first time. So this is the first time that I'm testifying from South Korea. So Chairman Maloney, Ranking Member Fishbach, Ranking Member Thompson, and distinguished members of the committee, thank you for inviting me here today on this important topic. I appreciate that this committee is looking at how to approach market regulation for digital assets. And as has been said previously, this couldn't be more timely. My name is Jonathan Levin, and I co-founded Chainalysis in 2014. I currently serve as our Chief Strategy Officer. I began studying cryptocurrencies 10 years ago through my research as an economist. But actually before that, my career started in commodities, studying the impact that speculators have on the price of copper. Having visited the London Metal Exchange several times, I appreciate how an orderly and well-functioning market that sets reference prices of important commodities is critical to the functioning of our global economy. I think the stakes are as high in the regulation of digital assets. While the internet brought about citizens much closer together in terms of global connectivity, it hasn't given everyone the same economic opportunities that were promised. The cryptocurrency industry provides a new way to conduct global commerce, creating these economic opportunities for people across the world. The entrepreneurial dynamism present in cryptocurrencies allows for innovators and builders to create universal access to financial products that better serve consumers and their data. This technology has the potential to be significant in the US competitiveness in the global economy over the coming decades. An important point that I want to make to members of this committee is that the transparency of blockchains enhances the ability of policymakers and government agencies to detect, disrupt, and ultimately deter illicit activity and abuse in cryptocurrency markets. By examining a cryptocurrency payment made by a scammer, government agencies are actually able to unlock insight into the entire network that is behind this illicit activity and the services that have relationship to that individual. In contrast, in a traditional criminal financial investigation, a similar tip linking an illicit actor to a bank account is just the beginning of a long, extensive process of legal requests and MLAT requests. As with any new technology, cryptocurrency can be used by both good and bad actors. In my written testimony, I outline some of the evidence that we have at Chainalysis about the scams, thefts, and types of manipulation that we have seen. Preventing cryptocurrency from being abused in this way is intricately connected to our ability to unlock its profound potential for our economy. We are in a unique position to help this industry mitigate the risks and in turn, increase the potential for a vibrant economy built on this new infrastructure. The transparency provided by cryptocurrency enables unique insights into cryptocurrency markets, including an understanding of market risks that enables surveillance. There is a great deal of data and information available to government agencies looking to understand this space. Whereas blockchain and analytics companies like Chainalysis survey and glean insights from transactions that are settled on the blockchain, there is also a lot of off-chain data that can be used to understand market manipulation trends and market manipulation in order books and alert on typologies related to this type of abuse. I make a number of recommendations in my written testimony, but a key recommendation I would like to highlight for this committee is that we should aim to create a stable, regulated market whereby the world looks to the United States for established asset reference cryptocurrency prices, just as they do for many other types of commodities. If America wants to lead in this sector, we must lead cryptocurrency market regulation. The clarification of cryptocurrency market regulator responsibilities would be a very important step for this market and would lend a great degree of order to the market functioning. I appreciate your time and look forward to your questions.
Thank you, gentlemen. Mr. Hoskinson, please, and Chainalysis rolls right off the tongue. Thank you, sir. And Mr. Hoskinson, you may proceed.
Hi, everybody. Chairman Maloney, Ranking Member Fishbach, members of the subcommittee, and congressional staffers who work so hard. Thank you for inviting me to testify at this hearing. I applaud the work of this subcommittee, and I appreciate you all taking the time to provide a forum for the blockchain industry. The blockchain industry has grown over the past decade from a small group of uncommercialized volunteer developers, and it was very small, believe me, to $1 trillion global economy encapsulating sophisticated engineering, scientific research, publicly traded companies, and millions of users. While our remarkable growth yields significant opportunities ranging from infrastructure security to entirely new economies like metaverses and NFTs, it also has presented new challenges and amplified the existing problems. Our legacy systems cannot handle the rapid movement of value without counterparty risk and require centralized middlemen. Our regulatory tools, risk management systems, and oversight processes were never designed for such speed, scale and rapid evolution. For example, in just 4 years, our industry has touched concepts ranging from IPOs to intellectual property to completely new business structures called DAOs that are effectively leaderless and jurisdiction-free. Reflecting upon the 20th century, the dominance of the United States has rested upon 3 pillars: our financial services, our technology companies, and our manufacturing capabilities. These industries are rapidly transforming under the demands of globalization, increased competition, new technologies, and our desire to define ESG rules to ensure a sustainable, values-driven global economy. At our core, our industry's technology is about creating distributed ledgers to store information that needs to be transparent, auditable, time-stamped, and immutable. This process enables records of social and economic concerns to be reliable and programmable. For example, as a rancher, I have to deal with water rights, grazing leases, BLM land, and numerous other agreements, contracts, and economic events. Many of these are not digitized, nor are they shared in ways to provide emergent value to policymakers, regulators, and researchers. The consequences of this fragmentation and lack of digitization are a large amount of inefficiency, replication of work, and a lack of access for entrepreneurs and innovators who could build new products and services that would dramatically reduce costs and improve efficiency for all stakeholders. The power of blockchain technology is its universality and permissionless model for innovation. Our company, Input Output, has never had to pay a royalty, file a patent application, or acquire a license to pursue business in countries as diverse as Ethiopia to Mongolia. Thus, we have to understand that categories-based regulation that is segregated to the borders of a particular jurisdiction and relies upon centralized actors for reporting and disclosure is unlikely to be effective and frankly will inhibit regulation. Furthermore, the internet's governance, evolution, and innovation are controlled by the ITU or some other transnational body, but rather by thousands of interconnected and interdependent agencies and private companies working towards the self-emerging common goals of increased connectivity, capacity, and utility. If we are to discuss how to regulate our industry, protect consumers, and align growth with the realities of modern society, then we ought to have the humility to admit innovation makes specifics difficult. We should focus on principles instead. Blockchains enable the liquidity of value, thought, and commerce at a scale and speed society has never enjoyed before. Instead of predicting the outcome of these new capabilities, we ought to decide on what risks we must guard against, what fundamental rights consumers should have, and how to use new tools for the greatest possible good. It seems prudent to focus on concepts like measuring decentralization, information asymmetries, accessibility of data, and access rather than arguing about jurisdictional bodies or asset categorization. Cryptocurrencies are financial stem cells at their core. They can be nearly any asset and can change over time. Principles don't change. For example, the notion of measuring consolidation and its risks has been an endeavor the United States has pursued and is frankly good at since the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. While none of us are personally familiar with life in the 1890s, we'd certainly be comfortable with the intent and concepts behind the Sherman Antitrust Act. Centralization of markets and power seldom leads to good outcomes. I hope we can engage in a fruitful and ongoing dialogue throughout the coming months as the United States debates the regulatory future of the American blockchain and cryptocurrency industry. Like the prior Congresses in the 1990s discussing the regulatory framework for the internet that led to the rise of trillion-dollar companies, I believe this Congress can achieve great results by working with our industry in a principles-based legislative approach and leveraging our capabilities to innovate and adapt. Thank you all for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Hoskinson. This time, members will be recognized for questions in order of seniority, alternating between majority and minority members. Members will be recognized for 5 minutes each in order to allow us to get to as many questions as possible. Please keep your microphones muted until you are recognized. especially on the Zoom, in order to minimize background noise. I'll now recognize myself for 5 minutes. Mr. Brummer, should CFTC have direct statutory authority to regulate cash markets?
Well, the CFTC, as I said, is certainly up to the job under a certain number of circumstances. Number one, obviously has to be financed and resourced properly. Secondly, and this is really the point of the conversation, all the regulatory agencies have to really have a change in their mindset. I think what you've heard from almost all of the witnesses is that the underlying infrastructure is very different from the infrastructure upon which many of our both securities and derivatives laws are based. And to really adequately oversee these markets, some degree of familiarity with those markets is going to be necessary. So whether or not the SEC or the CFTC, but the CFTC is certainly up to the job. It has certain kinds of comparative advantages, and it's those advantages that should be levered and to build upon those areas like disclosure where it has not traditionally wielded its authority.
Right. I'm struck by the line in your testimony where you said it will necessarily involve revisiting longstanding assumptions about market infrastructures embedded in securities and derivatives law and adapting the regulatory system in creative ways that reflect the best of our experience and collective values. What does that mean?
Yeah, I mean, it means, for example, that in the securities law context, our entire disclosure system is based off an assumption that issuers have non-public information that other expert actors don't have. And so therefore, you need to make sure that that information is available to them, and it kind of trickles down to your retail investor. So it's based, the evolution of our disclosure system, even in securities law, is for information to be filed, but not really read. When you go and you operate on a blockchain, completely different context, in part because much of the material, not all, but much of the material information that you'd need is already available on chain, but it's only accessible to the expert actors. It's the retail folks who would not have the ability to read and to understand the source code. So that gets you into a question as to what should the disclosure system look like? You should probably have more consumer protection principles, and to think about how do you get that information to those people in that system.
Yeah, it's a great question, but the one before it is the one I'm at least as interested in, which is who's best to do that? And so it brings me back to my first question, because I listened closely to your answer, and I understand it's complicated, and I understand the concerns about how it be done. It's actually very, very important. Is CFTC up to that?
CFTC is up to the job. It has the experience, in some ways, more direct experience in some ways, dealing with these issues than any other agency in the government. It's up to the job, but again, I not to be too law professory, but context matters, and it has to be properly resourced to do the job.
Right. Mr. McGonigal, good news. Professor says you're up to the job. Can you shed any light on my question, sir? Because I think the thing where at least I'm very interested in is it seems clear we need to legislate in this area, and we need to understand the follow-on consequences of that. And so help me understand, if we were to give direct statutory authority to CFTC for the cash spot markets, what should that look like?
Thank you, Chairman. I appreciate the question. At CFTC, we're a markets regulator. We think about how individual market participants from all aspects of, say, the production and user chain might access our markets in order to hedge risk or manage risk exposure. So interesting compared to the professor who was definitely spending some time thinking about like how the commodity could be used. CFTC thinks about how individuals are interested in the change in value of that commodity or digital asset, how that transaction or how that interest in that change in value can be regulated. And that's what our system of regulation is meant to accomplish. We look at market participants that are interested in trading value, and they're doing that in a centralized marketplace where there's price transparency, where they have execution certainty. They are able to get the product, the interest that they want, and they're able to do that in a safe and secure manner.
Isn't the critical wrinkle here that there's more speculation in the spot market with digital assets than there would be with the traditional commodity? And aren't you guys better set up for that?
So for sure, when you see in the commodity, in the spot market, there's a significant interest of speculative interest, also on a leverage basis. So putting a little
Retail.
money down.
Retail.
Right.
At the retail level.
Exactly, and trading significant funds with significant risks. And in a regulated market space, we have the opportunity, again, talking about disclosure obligations, to help inform those customers about this is the type of transaction that you're getting into, and making sure to the best we are able to facilitate customer protection so they understand the risks and they're prepared to accept those risks. And we're also have safeguards in place to protect those assets to the extent we're able.
All right. Well, thank the gentlemen. And if we have time for a second round, I'd be particularly interested in the subject Mr. Brummer opened in terms of the innovative ways we have to think about this, given the differences between this and what we've traditionally dealt with. Pleased to recognize the ranking member and to extend to her the same time allotment that I consumed.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And I can't not comment on Mr. Brummer saying it's hard for him not to be too law professory. So as when I was a law student, there's a lot of law professory stuff going on. So I appreciate it. But
I was more struck by the fact that he said we're his favorite members of
There you
Congress
go.
and of any committee, but
I'm a kid from Arkansas.
go right ahead.
But turning back to a little bit, the chair was asking a little bit about the CFTC. And I just wanted to ask Mr. McGonigal, you know, the CFTC is often referred to as a principle-based regulator. Could you tell us a little bit about what that means generally and your experience with that approach as it's been applied?
Yes, thank you. The question around principled base articulates that there are 23 core principles for designated contract markets that basically sets up the system of obligations that the entity has to comply with in order to list products for trading on our designated contract markets. And so they'll cover grounds including system safeguard, for example, core principle regarding the need that products that are listed not be readily susceptible to manipulation, that there be customer protection availability, there certainty for execution, for example, of the transaction, that you're able to have a counterparty that minimizes the risk. And we do that through a clearing system. We'll have one clearing organization that will be the counterparty for the transaction. So we are looking at a program of responsibility that not only is CFTC administering through application review, compliance, and surveillance. These designated contract markets also have responsibility on a self-regulatory basis to make sure that their market participants are complying with the rules. And then CFTC has broad enforcement authority to make sure that those market participants comply with the Commodity Exchange Act and the regulations.
Thank you. And maybe just, I've heard criticism about the CFTC that it's a permissive, light touch regulator. And would you agree with that? And if not, could you tell us some of your personal experiences why that criticism is unfounded?
Absolutely. So at CFTC, we strongly value our enforcement program. A strong enforcement program supports market integrity and customer protection. If people know that the rules of the road are supposed to be followed and that there is going to be a swift and strong response, that encourages compliance activity. So while we have a comprehensive regulatory framework, we also have a very strong enforcement program. As I mentioned in my opening remarks, we filed 50 cases on digital assets. We brought those cases starting in 2014. We're looking at fraud, pump and dump manipulation, illegal contracts that are being offered to U.S. customers, not only within the U.S., but from entities outside of the U.S. If there's a violation of the act or the regulation, the CFTC has strong enforcement authority to deter that misconduct. And if it involves a criminal violation, we work closely with our cooperative enforcement partners at the Department of Justice, as well as the U.S. Attorney's offices.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the information. And Mr. Hoskinson, did I say that? I'm trying.
Yes.
Thank you very much. And I know we just have a few seconds left, but there's a lot of discussion about whether we should regulate certain cryptocurrency as commodities or securities. What do you think might the benefits? And maybe you could talk just a little bit about that. What are the drawbacks, things like that?
Well, with 37 seconds.
No, I'm sorry. Yeah.
No, the gentleman can take as much time as he requires.
Oh, thank you, Mr.
Well,
Chair.
I
There you go.
appreciate that. Thank you.
I mean, don't push it, but
It's a fine line
You got
here.
to be careful. I'm Italian. So, when you look at cryptocurrencies in general, I've always viewed them like financial stem cells. They're kind of more fundamental than a particular category, like a currency or a commodity. And really, it depends on the markets they're traded on and the use and utility that they have. But at the end of the day, you have to ask yourself, what public policy considerations are you attempting to satisfy? Is it sanctions compliance? Is it consumer protection? Is it market stability? What we do as an industry is we're all about transparency. So it's kind of funny, we're talking and debating about disclosure regimes. There's no other financial asset in the world that really is as transparent as a cryptocurrency. Every transaction from the very beginning for Bitcoin, for example, from January 3rd, 2009 is known. Every single one. The holdings of the founder are known because all of these things are publicly available to everybody. So it's more about, in my view, understandability and the tooling required to make this work on a global basis. So I don't think it would be wise to say, well, is it a security or a commodity, or fall into this temptation of who's the more permissive regulator or what is the regulatory arbitrage, but rather just take a step back and say, what things do we want to guard against? And we now have 13 13 years of history as an industry of, I think, 6 or 7 collapses, a whole bunch of interesting new things like NFTs that have always pushed the limit, and a global marketplace with more than 100 million people floating around that we can draw from, and we can look on a case-by-case basis and build a framework that makes sense. What's encouraging to me as an entrepreneur, briefly, is that there's a lot of great legislation that's been proposed recently, like the DCA, the FIA. There's executive orders that have come through that are trying to force clarity amongst the executive branch. So these things together create a global dialogue, and if we're clever about it, I think we can converge to a reasonable compromise that we as an industry can live with and continue to be competitive with.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. And thank you, Mr. Chair, for your indulgence.
Thank the gentlelady. I'd like to yield to the ranking member. Do you guys have any questions? Mr. Thompson.
Well, Chairman, thank you so much. Mr. McGonigal, first of all, thank you for your dedicated service and your experience at CFTC. Much appreciated. Earlier this year, as noted a number of times, I've introduced the Digital Commodity Exchange Act, DCA, along with Mr. Khanna, Mr. Emmer, Mr. Soto. Among other things, the DCA creates a new registered entity, a quote, digital commodity exchange, end quote, DCE, subject to a registration and compliance regime. This is similar to the existing first registered futures exchanges and swap execution facilities under the Commodity Exchange Act. Can you please tell us generally about the requirements CFTC imposes on future exchanges and the CEFs?
I'm sorry, Ranking Member, the door opened.
No
The
problem.
last phrase, if you could just restate that for me.
I just noted that under the DCA, what we've done to DCA, and there was it was very similar to the existing registered futures exchange and swap execution facilities under the current Commodity Exchange Act. And so the question was, can you tell us generally about the requirements the CFTC imposes on future exchanges and SEFs?
Great. Thank you, Ranking Member, and I appreciate indulging me with following up. With respect to designated contract markets, swap execution facilities, those entities are responsible to establish and set up their self-regulatory organizations. So the rules that they implement on their platform are the rules that they also have to ensure that there is compliance with. So for example, they will establish trading protocols, and they will establish prohibitions concerning market abuse. That self-regulatory organization responsibility is to make sure then that those market participants follow the rules of the road. At the same time, the self-regulatory organization has responsibilities to the Commission and to Congress as part of the 23 core principles. So for example, they need to make sure that their trading platforms are cyber resilient, and that is that they have the ability to operate in the event that someone attempts to breach their system, that they have capacity to roll over, for example, to another trading platform to allow trading to continue, because it's incredibly important for our market participants who are trading in the markets, who have risk exposure that they need to manage, that our markets be able to operate efficiently at all times.
Okay, well, thank you for that. Dr. Brummer, as Ranking Member Fischbach alluded to, there's some uncertainty about when and if an asset is a commodity or a security, and some argue that the vast majority of digital assets are just securities. Is the law clear on this?
No, and if it was, all of my students would be getting an A in my securities law class. I mean, but by definition, I mean the Howey test, leads to some clarity in some instances, but in others, obviously, there's ambiguity, in part because each of the prongs of the Howey test, the SEC case that sort of defines when you have a security, are very much intended to be sort of contextually based. And, whether or not, you may know that there's an investment of money, but, when are you relying on the efforts of others? What does that actually mean in a digital context? What does a common enterprise mean when you're operating on a platform? Certainly, when is money money? Which is a little bit more established under securities law, but in financial regulation writ large, can and often is subject to considerable debate. So, but what is clear is that it is not the case that all digital assets are securities, even under established longstanding principles. And there have been various declarations made by leaders of both the SEC and the CFTC that some of those digital assets with the largest market cap are in fact commodities.
In your testimony, you noted the CFTC and SEC have different regulatory strength and that there are benefits to each. In many ways, this is what Mr. Khan and I recognized in the DCA. For example, we propose the SEC would continue to regulate capital raising activities with their associated disclosures for investors, and the CFTC would govern the trading of any token, which is a digital commodity, using registered exchanges to fulfill the role of a gatekeeper for market participants. As we continue to think about how we should structure this regulatory regime, what else should Congress consider?
I think it's important, and some of the more recent cases have, particularly in the last 2 weeks, have sort of highlighted, is that as this technology grows, as this technology scales, you're going to have different kinds of actors that can also be operating on chain. And when we get to these very important questions like what is decentralized and what is a decentralized actor, what happens when you have more centralized actors who by definition may have off-chain operations that are more opaque? What does it mean when these digital markets intersect with the larger off-chain economy? And I think that that's going to be a critical question. There's a disclosure aspect to it. There's a market infrastructure question to that. And it's going to be something that lawmakers and regulators are going to have to think through.
Very good. Well, thank you. Thank you to all our witnesses. Thank you, Chairman.
I thank the gentleman. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Rush.
I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, for today's hearing. The timing of today's hearing is very apt. Cryptocurrency markets have been on a roller coaster in recent months. In the last few weeks have seen an absolute and horrible meltdown. As Bitcoin has lost over half of its value, and such coins as Terra USD have melted down so horrifically to cause concern for the rest of the industry. Frankly, Mr. Chairman, I am concerned. I am concerned that this industry does not adequately disclose its risk and volatility as it tries to lure in new and unsuspecting money, as it did when multiple crypto exchanges showed ads during this year's Super Bowl. I am concerned about the lack of transparency also of some of the cryptocurrencies, such as so-called stable coins, some of which have been recently collapsing, and those that could potentially cause harm to the rest of the global economy. As the chair of the Subcommittee on Energy within the Energy and Commerce Committee, I'm concerned with the stress that cryptocurrency mining facilities are putting on our electric grid in the summer, where North blackouts in Texas, California, and some of the Midwestern states is already being receiving warnings. Finally, Mr. Chairman, as someone who cares deeply about this country, I'm concerned that the growing political power of cryptocurrency companies and worry about the potential for regulatory capture by the industry and its new forays into dark money investment into political races, including my local race here in Chicago for my replacement in Congress. Now I understand that certainly all of the above does not fall within the jurisdiction of the Ag Committee or the Cftc, and I know that all of them are not the subject of today's hearing. Dr. Burner, I appreciate your testimony on financial inclusion, ensuring that communities like mine on the south side of Chicago that have been traditionally excluded from generating wealth are not excluded from the potential explosion of wealth that blockchain technology could create. However, I'm deeply concerned about the destruction of wealth that we have seen in crypto markets this year. How do we prevent these markets from preying on overlooked and vulnerable communities, Dr. Bruner, and prevent those communities that have been robbed of so much from having their wealth further stripped by financial vultures and then looming overhead?
Yeah, that is an excellent question, and like you, this is something I've shared with many of the country's regulators, particularly with the state regulators around the country. One of the primary challenges with the question of disclosure and the degree to which Black and brown communities are preyed upon is that the degree of complexity in any kind of financial instrument, whether or not it be cryptocurrency or CDOs from 2008, complexity introduces the opportunity for vulnerability. And the question that all of our regulatory agencies are going to have to face, and this is getting back to this mindset question, is understanding that disclosure, particularly where you do have large numbers of retail investors, that the way in which you think about disclosure is going to have to be rethought. And both because of the complexity of the financial instrument and the kinds of assumptions that our regulatory space has traditionally made. I do think that the industry itself is going to have to face some challenges as well. As this industry scales and it seeks both new customers but also new kinds of ideas, it's going to have inputs from much broader sources of society. People from between the coasts, minority communities, are all going to have to participate more. I think it's good on a number of levels. Number one, I think to the degree to which you have more sort of different kinds of people participating in the product design, you're going to be able to reach use cases that are going to be much more applicable to a broader slice of the public. I think that when you have people from different backgrounds largely helping to think through the technology, there's a natural green shoot that comes from the consumer protection space. People sort of talk about what's required, frankly, for a real democratization of finance, and if you want to get some of the benefits that blockchain technology professes, opportunities like decentralized identity or opening up the credit box through decentralized credit scoring, closing the costs or reducing costs on mortgages, or figuring out new kinds of compliance systems for MDIs and minority depository institutions. You have to have more brain power involved in different kinds of perspectives. And I think, again, when you have those people participating in the room and in the design and in the strategy sessions for these companies that are still, figuring out how they diversify their operations, that's going to be a critical piece to really speaking to the very real threats and challenges that are out there when less when vulnerable communities intersect with anything that is inherently complex.
Gentleman's time has expired. Chair now recognizes Mr. Balderson from Ohio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you to all the witnesses for being here today. A common theme that I've heard when meeting with stakeholders in this space is that they believe the CFTC is the best position to assume oversight of spot markets for digital assets. Chairman Maloney touched on this, but I would like for you all to expand on it. I'll start with you, Mr. McGaggle, but if any witnesses have thoughts, please feel free to share them. Do you agree that the CFTC is well suited to oversee spot markets for the digital assets? And what authorities, if any, does the CFTC need to assume regulatory authority over digital spot markets?
Thank you, Congressman. Certainly the way that digital assets are being traded in the cash market today very strongly resembles how digital assets are traded as a derivative. And what I mean by that is where there's an interest in the change in the price of a particular commodity, and so there's trading around that interest. That is an area that CFTC...
Gentleman will suspend. Chair just reminds members to mute, please, if you're not on camera or speaking. Thank you. Gentleman may proceed.
Thank you. So CFTC has a comprehensive oversight with respect to applications for contract markets, compliance by contract markets, surveillance of activity on those contract markets. And I think all of those concepts, as well as the enforcement piece that I spoke about earlier, all those concepts relate to trading that's occurring in digital asset spot markets. With respect to the regulatory authority, I understand and appreciate that there's a lot of thinking around possible regulatory structures. I will point out just quickly that, following Dodd-Frank, CFTC received statutory authority with respect to swap execution facilities. And there was a determination by Congress to articulate core principles 15, similar in scope and kind, to the core principles that we have for designated contract markets. The Commission then entered into an extensive public comment period where we took the guidance that we had from Congress with respect to implementation of those core principles and set forth our proposed rules concerning trading on platform focused on market transparency, as well as clearing obligations and some dealer responsibilities. So not intermediary oversight like we have currently in DCM space, but that would be something that would be important for evaluating the digital asset spot complex.
Thank you for that answer. Would anybody else like to add on to the question? Okay.
I'll take a bite at it.
All right, perfect, thank you.
I am not a security lawyer or an expert on regulations, so take it with a grain of salt. But I don't think it's a question of, as I mentioned before, who is more permissive or who's less restrictive. It's more of a question of efficacy. And when you look at commodities are intrinsically decentralized. So I grow hay on one of my farms, and I didn't have to ask permission. There's no central hay agency. We're not the Soviet Union. We don't regulate things that way. And then suddenly when I cut it and I sell it, it enters into a global marketplace. Now that marketplace has rules and principles and protections, and there's a retail component. People feed horses, and then there's certainly an industrial component. So if cryptocurrencies are truly decentralized and that actually is a real thing, then it does make sense to embed that into a framework that's designed for things that are intrinsically this way. And you have to look out for cartels, market manipulation. You have to look out for where global actors try to come in, like China or others, and take over a market, like they're trying to do the lithium markets. But that's a very different type of notion than a security in that respect. So my view, the most effective thing that can be done over the next 12, 24 months is to have a really good notion of what is decentralization and what are the factors that produce that. And if it gets past a certain threshold, it makes a lot of natural sense to regulate things like a commodity as opposed to a security. And if they don't, well, then it's very obvious who has the disclosure requirement.
Well done. So thank you for your answer. Mr. Chairman, with the lack of remaining time, I'll yield back. Thank you.
Thank the gentleman. Chair recognizes Ms. Craig.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. And thank you to Ranking Member Fischbach for today's hearing on digital asset regulation. Thanks so much to the witnesses for your expert testimony. Obviously, this is clearly a space with complex policy considerations and a great deal of public and private interest. One of the things that I've been tracking today during this hearing and over the course of the 117th Congress is just how many of these conversations about regulatory authority will impact many of the retail investors that have moved into the crypto space over the last few years. With that in mind, I know we're giving you a bit of a workout today, but Director McGonigal, I'm coming to you with my first question. Director McGonigal, can you speak about how federal regulation of crypto trading platforms under the Commodity Exchange Act is related to market transparency and ultimately to ensuring that retail investors have access to the information they need to properly weigh the risk involved?
Thank you, Congresswoman. I appreciate the question. In thinking about spot markets, say in particular, and overlap of an issue that we are focused on for derivatives products, deals with the concept or the prospect around leverage, an understanding by the individual investor, particularly where that individual investor is a retail participant, that they know and appreciate the risk of trading. While there may be good upside for putting, say, 50 cents down and having $1 worth of a position, there's incredible downside if the market moves against your position. So at CFTC, we're focused not only on market integrity, that we want to have a centralization or a place where market participants can come together and understand what the pricing is, but we also look to have a system of intermediary oversight that focuses on retail market participants, say in particular, with a disclosure regime that informs those market participants sort of based on who they're dealing with. So for example, if it's a commodity trading advisor or commodity pool operator, that the risk of the trading strategy are disclosed, as well as associated fees. Those are disclosed. That individual market participant understands how their funds are being protected or utilized at a futures commission merchant, for example, that those funds are segregated, and how those funds can also be protected, for example, in the event of a bankruptcy. So we do look for execution certainty as well as customer protection as part of our regulatory regime, and I think that's helpful to the dialogue here.
I don't want to take up too much more time, but just I've been listening here for quite a while, and I hear you saying that your agency has the capacity and the expertise to take on any additional regulatory role in this digital asset space. Is that what I'm hearing from you today?
So we definitely have the intellectual expertise. We have ongoing responsibility now to implement and ensure regulatory compliance with new market participants that are currently seeking applications for designation as contract markets, for example, as well as ensuring that those entities continue compliance. So we're able to take that skill set to the extent that we're dealing with like-to-like, similar types of core principles. We are able to transition that work, and I used earlier the example with respect to swaps. But that also involves certainly a resource determination, and depending on
And so I do think that that is one interesting and important feature, particularly in a space that is constantly evolving, and where the rulemaking is going to have to be very agile. So that is something that I look to as a potential comparative advantage.
Thank you so much, Dr. Brummer. And seeing that I have exceeded my time, I thank the chairman and yield back.
I thank the gentlelady. Gentleman from Florida, Ms. Comment.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Fishbach. I appreciate all our witnesses for being here today. And as has been discussed, since 2014, the CFTC has been regulating crypto derivatives and has also been exercising its anti-fraud and anti-manipulation enforcement authority over digital asset spot markets. The agency clearly has extensive experience overseeing digital assets, including futures, which retail users have been trading through a direct access model. Now, Mr. Brummer, isn't it the case that several exchanges registered with the CFTC today offer retail traders the ability to directly access exchanges without a broker, including through ICE, Eris, and Kalishi exchanges.
It is true to my knowledge that yes, that there are some direct. Yeah, I know ErisX. I'm not entirely sure about the others, but yes.
Okay. And this is for you again, Mr. Brimmer and Mr. McDonald. I messed that up. I am so sorry. I'd like to ask each of you, do you agree that federal regulation of crypto trading platforms under the Commodity Exchange Act would raise the floor rather than establish a ceiling of required reporting and investor protections above the currently provided by the existing state-by-state money transmitters licensing regime?
Yes, thank you, Congresswoman. Certainly, as a markets regulator, it would establish a floor. We're a different purpose than the money exchange state licensing, and so I wouldn't be in a position necessarily to compare how those state-by-state provisions may overlap in some instances, but to the extent that we're talking again about managing risk, CFTC has a system of regulation in place.
Mr. Brummer?
That's right. That the purposes of the money transmitter laws are different. They tend to be at the state level somewhat less resource, but the entire focus is a little bit different. So there would be some overlap, but it's a little bit of apples to oranges.
I know. I'm pushing you to try to get to a point here, but thank you both for your responses. Mr. McGonigal, how does the CFTC's expertise and experience regulating complex derivatives markets translate to crypto markets?
Thank you again, Congresswoman. The CFTC offers the opportunity for multiple market participants to come together to execute transactions where there is price transparency. Individuals who are trading in the market understand the product that they are trading, and they understand the price and volume for how they are trading that product. There are also rules in place with respect to how those customers possibly are entering their transactions on the market. And what I mean possibly, and you alluded to earlier, to the extent that they're going through an intermediary, that there is additional protections available to a retail market participant, including the types of risk disclosure and segregation and protection of assets. And then ultimately, the transactions go to a clearing facility, and centralizing that clearing facility minimizes the risk that you may see currently in spot platforms, for example, who do not have centralized clearing, instead are exposed to individual counterparties.
Thank you for that. I appreciate it. And one last question, since I've got about a minute left. I understand that you all have been working closely with the SEC on exchange regulation in this space. Day doesn't go by that I don't catch an article about this. Regarding this coordination and cooperation, how productive are these discussions to coordinate going, and how are they going? And do you see any concerns or gaps in the current conversations with SEC that still need to be addressed?
So, thank you, Congresswoman. I guess I was reflecting on.
Are you sure you want to say thank you?
I was reflecting on the 25 years with CFTC. In my experience, we have a longstanding relationship, particularly on enforcement, but also on regulatory matters. We talk all the time. We need to talk, and those conversations are always productive.
Are there any gaps that you see?
As between the two agencies, we understand where our jurisdictions come together. We discuss when they overlap. In physical digital assets, the regulation is we don't have regulatory authority over those products.
Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. Ms. Custer, and I will remind the members that we do have a fourth witness who's up in the middle of the night in Asia. We haven't forgotten about you, Mr. Levin. The perils of being on Zoom. Ms. Custer.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for our panel being with us, especially you, Mr. Levin, joining us from South Korea. I will have a question for you. We're in the midst of a brave new world of digital asset trading. Our committee has given this issue worthwhile attention because of the role that the Commodity Futures Trading Commission has and will continue to play in regulating this trade. As more and more Americans invest in these assets, it's imperative for Congress to keep up as we regulate and oversee the digital realm, just as we do with more established markets. As we've all seen recently, Bitcoin, the most popular cryptocurrency, has badly tumbled in the last few weeks and lost more than half its value in 2022 so far. Clearly, no marketplace is immune from severe vulnerability and uncertainty, be it Bitcoin or Wall Street. But we do need to assure digital markets are operating above board and that they're secure and that investors have access to the information they need to fully understand the risks they're undertaking. With that in mind, I'm going to focus my questions on consumer protection as it relates to digital assets. And going to you first, Mr. Levin, thank you for being with us from South Korea. Could you speak to how prevalent risky cryptocurrency exchanges are, such as those that lack know your customer rules, may have criminal ties, or may be connected to the dark web?
Thank you, Congresswoman. And yes, this is exactly what Chainalysis focuses on, is mapping all of the different participants that actually facilitate transactions in cryptocurrencies. And to your point, we have seen over the last few years, exchanges in offshore jurisdictions actually used to facilitate the laundering of proceeds from things like ransomware. And so, OFAC has taken action to designate certain of these exchanges like SUEX and CHADEX as cryptocurrency exchanges that have facilitated that. I think that does speak, though, to the ability for us to focus the discussion here on how do we appropriately equip a market regulator with overseeing the venues that we think should form the reference prices for these commodities and ensure the orderly functioning of markets. And also, we've seen Treasury take necessary action to enforce rules around AML across the board internationally as well. And that's been very clear in sort of the actions that Treasury has taken.
So let's delve into that. Director McGonigal, you mentioned in your testimony, since 2014, the CFTC has brought more than 50 enforcement actions against digital asset markets for issues like fraud, manipulation, and false reporting. Could you speak to how the investigation process works at CFTC? And do you feel there's more authority or certainly financial support you may need from Congress to strengthen CFTC's enforcement role?
Thank you, Congresswoman. I appreciate the question. When it comes to enforcement authority, the CFTC has very broad and strong authority. Our anti-fraud, anti-manipulation authority, as you mentioned, it extends into the physical market. So where we have brought cases involve all manner of misrepresentations, pump and dump schemes that are manipulating prices. They had a comment about Bank Secrecy Act or anti-money laundering. We brought cases where entities have a registration obligation with CFTC and because of the products they were offering and did not seek registration and also violated AML provisions. We also look at fraud in the context of illegal contracts. So for example, if it's a leverage contract that doesn't result in the delivery of the actual physical currency within a period of time, that falls within CFTC's anti-fraud authority, and it's treated as if it's a futures contract.
And can you elaborate on how these crimes work? You've given an example, but what you all have identified as emerging trends in illicit activity related to digital assets that you are on the lookout for. I know I do a lot of work in the addiction and opioid space, but also sex trafficking. And it looks like my time is up, so we'll have to see if we can beg the chairman's indulgence for your response.
The gentleman may proceed.
Yes, thank you. And say in particular, the attraction to leverage so that, sort of get rich quick because individual investors are at 50-to-1 leverage, for example, like that is a significant risk concern. We also see digital assets where they may not be the subject of the fraud, but they're the payment mechanism in connection with other fraud schemes, like, for example, Forex fraud that CFTC has jurisdiction over.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Feenstra. Excuse me, Mr. Scott.
Psych.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Am I right, Mr.
Oh.
Scott? I think I got that right.
I apologize. I had to step out. I had a meeting in my office with constituents, but I'm going to start with you, Mr. McGonigal. This isn't, it's not corn, it's not gold, it's certainly not dollars. And there are a lot of questions here. One is if the U.S. is going to regulate, then it's CFTC versus SEC. Some have suggested even a new agency. Then there's the how, if you do that, and then there's the who do you regulate. So my understanding is there are 20,000 approximately cryptocurrencies in the world worth about $3 trillion. Is that close? Give or take $1 trillion on a day on the values, but somewhere around 20,000 currencies. I mean, the question I have, 20,000 currencies, CFTC, how many people work at the CFTC today?
Yeah, thank you, Congressman. Several hundred.
Several hundred. So you would be talking about, if they gave up everything that they're currently doing, you're talking about, 100 cryptocurrencies a person. My point is, it's not possible to regulate all of these currencies. It's just not. And so then the question becomes who? And I mean, is it that we're going to have a value if the currency reaches a certain dollar figure that all of a sudden we're going to regulate it? I'm interested in any comments that any of you may have on, of the 20,000 cryptos, how you determine who should be regulated.
Well, one of the powers of our industry is the fact that regulation can become algorithmic. So you don't have to think, well, which person's going to sit down and look at this big pile? Think of the IRS and tax returns. We could quadruple the size of the IRS. We still couldn't audit every single American. It's just not possible. And so what you have to do say, what tools do we have at our capability? And what's magical about cryptocurrency is that in the transactions themselves, they can carry metadata, they can carry identity. Rule makers and policymakers can take a step back and say, well, these are the things that we care about, and we can make sure inside the systems that those things don't settle and clear until those things are present. So it's really more of a conversation of what do you care about? And then what we can do as technologists is create a self-certification system. And then what can happen is when there are anomalies or special cases, which often would be rare, then the CFTC or another regulatory body could look through and say, well, let's investigate that. That's generally how we do law enforcement in the nation. We don't break into everybody's house. We wait until we get a warrant. You have to have some cause for it. So there needs to be some social infrastructure for that.
So self-certification is different than an agency regulating.
Well, they're interconnected. So you have SROs, you have market standards, you have principles, and in many cases, financial regulation is mostly done by SROs or private organizations. If you look at, for example, compliance, it's not the SEC or the CFTC going out there doing KYC and AML. It's banks that are doing these types of things. So it's a public-private partnership, and what needs to be done is to establish those boundaries. And then what we can do as innovators is write software to help make that happen. And literally, that's what Chainalysis is doing right now, and their competitors.
I think, I mean, I don't see a way for us to regulate them all. I do think if it's going to happen, there has to be some type of self-certification of it. What I do fear, because I don't think that crypto should be a significant portion of the average investor's portfolio. I don't. I mean, I do fear that if we all of a sudden are regulating it, then the average investor feels like there's more security and stability in the value of it. And I think that's a dangerous thing for the investors. And I would tell you, I'd be very concerned about the average American citizen having more than 5% of their investments in the crypto markets. I'm not talking about guys like you who know it inside and out, but I've expressed my concerns. I appreciate your comments on the self-certification. I do think that's a path that we need to be considering. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield the remainder of my time.
I appreciate the gentleman yielding his 3 seconds. Mr. Feenstra is recognized.
Thank you so much, Chairman Maloney and Ranking Member Fishbach. It's great we're having this discussion today, and it's so important. Digital asset market regulation is critical. Mr. McGonigal, in addition to the requirements that apply to all CFTC regulated futures and derivative exchanges, would the CFTC require additional authority from Congress to promulgate additional crypto-specific requirements if the CFTC were to be given primary regulatory authority over digital asset trading platforms by Congress?
Yes, Congressman, we would need additional regulatory authority.
Yep. And what go down that path? What are you looking for?
Currently, for both designated contract markets and for swap execution facilities, there's a system of core principles that the agency has. And more recently, with respect to the swaps implementation, we engaged in extensive public comment around the establishment of setting up the operation of the facilities, trading facilities, clearing, as well as any other regulated or registered entity like swap dealers, for example.
So do you agree that the evolution or maturation of a digital asset and its underlying network has the potential to remove security-like characteristics over time for assets to become fully decentralized or permissible less?
Right. So
Is there a parallel in that regard?
Totally appreciate that question, and that is an interesting topic. Digital assets are broadly defined to be commodities.
Yep.
If there is a determination under current law that the SEC determines that it's a security, then it takes it outside of CFTC jurisdiction, and there isn't currently a framework that would allow evolution of the product to put it back into CFTC
That's
jurisdiction.
correct. And that'd be a problem. So is there a parallel there with regard to that evolution then to the swaps?
I think how we handled swaps is we divided the market, right? And so characteristics of certain swaps that were more closely aligned with the SEC were at SEC. SEC and CFTC communicated, dialogue, and worked together on rules that impacted both of our jurisdictions.
Okay.
So that is something that is available to the agencies.
Yep. So one more question. How do you think the notion of fully decentralized should be defined or determined? And at what point or at what triggering event should that determination be made? And then through what process? And I know this is a tangled web here.
Right. So it is a tangled web. And I guess from CFTC's vantage, I don't consider or look at how the thing presents, right? Whether it's like so-called decentralized, as opposed to, is it something where there's a trading interest? There's many market participants are interested in trading and understanding how it trades. Yep. So from our perspective, we probably would be encouraging not so much a definition of what is decentralized, but whether the underlying digital asset is something that should fall within regulation of CFTC under our structure,
yes,
as opposed to defining
right,
this other structure.
Right. And would you need more congressional intent to go down that rabbit hole, that path?
So certainly, if Congress wanted to further clarify the extent of CFTC's jurisdiction as it applied to any further legislation, that would be appropriate. Yep. But as I mentioned, we currently have digital assets as a defined commodity.
Right. Okay. Thank you for your information. This is a great area, and we have to embrace it. And I appreciate your comments. Thank you.
Thank the gentleman. Mr. Cloud.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you all for being here, and thank you, Ranking Member, for hosting this. I carry some of the concerns, I guess, about regulation that some of the former members have carried, just because a lot of times the government will see mission creep. And so one of the great appeals of cryptocurrencies when I talk to people who kind of dabble in it is the fact that there's not an intermediary at this point. And so I also had the question about who and how and those sorts of things. How do we keep this limited? What is the current market failure we're trying to fix, basically, and how do we keep it, any sort of regulation, narrowed to that, and in such a way that over time it doesn't become very much invasive? And if you can answer that, but I'll point out Mr. Hoskinson mentioned the banks as an example of how this is done well. If you talk to the bankers, a lot of them will talk about how this is not done very well, in the fact that they have to be the authoritarian arm of the federal government in a lot of different ways. So anyway, your thoughts on that, and feel free to chime in.
Yeah. Thank you, Congressman, for the opportunity to address that particular issue around the certification of products currently at CFTC. It is in a situation where an exchange can willy-nilly certify a product and allow that for trading. There are all core principles apply, but in particular, not readily susceptible to manipulation. So what we're getting at is who's interested in trading this product and why? And is there sufficient liquidity, for example, or sufficient interest by market participants that there actually is a market value to exchange or trade risk? Certainly in our markets, we think of why individuals would want to hedge. They're producers, farmers, end users, and they have an interest in the actual underlying commodity. But we also see interest in cash settled contracts, these financially settled obligations. And I think that under our current system of regulation, we have an ability to winnow out activity or contracts that don't provide a market value.
Any of you want to speak to that, or have another question to move on to?
Sure. Can I comment on the KYC AML side?
Sure.
I don't think anybody's doing KYC AML well, and nobody wants to be a data broker. It's pretty crazy what's going on right now. I'm a big believer that you have to understand what private industry has been doing over the last century or so. If you look at Google, you look at Facebook, you look at these companies, they're more than companies. They don't just go and make sprockets and cars or something and they compete in a fair market. They're ending up getting a lot of control and power over foundational resources. So if we look at the prior centuries, like Standard Oil, it got control over the energy industry. And then we said, boy, that's probably not a good idea. We should do something about it. Now, when we look at Google, Facebook, these other companies, they've gained so much control over information, thought, speech, and other foundational resources, hosting. They actually can define an entire marketplace and decide who gets to compete and who doesn't. It's relevant to cryptocurrencies in the blockchain industry because at the end of the day, it's the liberation of those resources. That's what we're really doing here. To separate the wheat from the chaff, we're talking about a resource-based economy. The point of decentralization is saying that maybe nobody should be in control of our freedom of expression or commerce or association. So that requires a fundamentally different way of interfacing with those marketplaces, different way of handling identity and compliance.
I only have a minute, so if I can
Sure.
jump in here. The fact that you're talking about big tech, I think, is very interesting in this, because you also mentioned that one of the features of regulation is that we can use algorithms now.
That's
Yet
right.
we've seen them use algorithms to limit people's freedom of speech and to do all these other nefarious things. So if we give the government that power, especially, as the Federal Reserve is looking toward creating a digital currency potentially, and we already have banks being thrust upon them to enforce ESG scores. And in China, we see where those ESG scores suddenly become personal scores on individuals. It's not a far step technologically, and in the way we see some of the agencies working right now to begin to target those algorithms toward
Right.
people and their personal habits and their spending. So how do we compete economically on the world stage without threatening the privacy rights of Americans going forward? Because this is a very dangerous slope if not handled correctly.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I'm deeply concerned by social credit, deeply concerned by some of the proposals for CBDCs, because you can have transactional discrimination against any ethnic group you want or any political philosophy you want. So the point is the algorithms ought to be built out in an open source process, transparent and available to all, and people have to have the ability to opt in instead of opt out. So the power of our industry is we didn't have a government agency or some central actor say, oh, here's cryptocurrencies. It was the tireless work of millions of people, many of which never met each other around the world, coming together voluntarily and building a new economy worth trillions of dollars. That's the way we ought to think about it, not how do we create some government agency or how do we create some central bank or central algorithm that'll control everything. And then you ask yourself about the outcomes you desire. So it's clear that there's been some problems over the last 13 years and we're working our way through that. But at the same time, we have created value for millions of people, and we shouldn't lose that sight.
Gentleman's time has expired. Thank the gentleman. Concludes our initial round of questions. Seeing no other members in the room, I'm going to extend an opportunity for a selective round of additional questions. If the ranking member has anything, I'm happy to yield to her.
If we're prepared to, and I don't see any others, but I just wanted to express another thank you to everybody, because this has been an incredible informational kind of meeting that we've been able to have. And I have, again, thanked the chair for bringing us together, but thank you to all of the witnesses.
Well, I thank the gentleman. I take it that's also your closing remarks. Appreciate that. Thank you to all of today's witnesses. Want to be respectful of your time. Let me just say in closing, given this committee's jurisdiction over this Commodity Futures Trading Commission, market volatility and continued growth of this industry, it's important we remain active and engaged as a participant, and have these conversations to consider and determine appropriate and necessary legislation and regulation in this industry. As you know, since Bitcoin was released in 2009, the digital asset market has experienced explosive growth, innovation, and evolution. And the testimony we've heard today certainly highlights those market evolutions and indicate that that'll be a key characteristic of the digital asset industry for the foreseeable future. And of course, as recent developments have shown, we also understand the volatility of these markets and the risks that come with that. The potential solutions this technology can offer are worthy of a regulatory regime that will allow for continued innovation while also establishing and requiring platforms adhere to a uniform set of standards and guidelines, and will protect those that choose to participate. While there are many more conversations to be had, I'm certainly glad that our committee is remaining active in this discussion regarding the future of the digital asset regulation. Also, would want to stress the importance we all put on the United States having a leadership role in this space. I'd like to thank the committee chairman, Mr. Scott, for the opportunity to chair the subcommittee. I'm also very proud to take this leadership role at this critical time. I look forward to conducting additional hearings. We're just getting started. And of course, would be eager to hear additional relevant testimony here at the Commodity Exchanges Energy Credit Subcommittee. I want to thank the ranking member, Ms. Fischbach, for joining me today. Thank particularly our witness in Asia for getting up late. And with that, the committee stands adjourned. Excuse me, I have to do one other piece of housekeeping, I believe, which is to tell you that under the rules of the committee, the record of today's hearing will remain open for 10 calendar days to receive additional material and supplementary written responses from the witnesses to any questions posed by a member. And with that, this hearing of the Subcommittee on Commodity Exchanges, Energy and Credit is adjourned.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for watching. What did you think about this? We're in the very, very early stages of crypto. And what I find intriguing is Charles Hoskinson is there. We may have not heard much as we wanted to hear, but he is the developer of Cardano, and he was partners with the Ethereum project. So this is why I, in my opinion, not financial advice, I'm so certain that Cardano is going to overturn Ethereum. And I honestly feel in the not short term, but in the very near future, that Bitcoin will not stay number one. Why aren't Bitcoin developers sitting in Congress? Because whoever the developer is gone. There's no faces behind Bitcoin. There's just investors, and they're billionaire investors that are behind Bitcoin. Bitcoin will always get its props for opening up the whole door to crypto. But like I said, crypto has to have a use case, a purpose. There's 20,000 plus cryptos. There's, I think, a couple of thousand exchanges, and those need to be regulated. The people who develop shit coins and rug pulls and scam coins, I personally feel they need to be criminally charged. There needs to be some penalties. Even the influencers, the YouTubers, the people on TikTok, on Discords, they need to be penalized for shilling, for manipulating people, for bull crapping people. I've seen a handful of coins that the developers are like, yeah, Elon Musk is with this project, and it's bullshit. It's not real. Do your own research and research several places. Yes, listen to influencers and take whatever information you get from each and every one of them, including myself, and figure out what makes sense. Use common sense, but continuously educate yourself, talk to people, listen to people, And there's nothing sexier, there's nothing healthier than educating your mind. Educating yourself daily is definitely food for the brain. And if you're investing your money, your hard-earned money, into crypto, do research. Everybody can win if we're purchasing and investing the correct projects. Remember, use case, purpose, utility. You don't see the Bitcoin people at this Congress meeting. You don't see the Shiba Inu people. You don't see the Vote Inu. You don't see the Floki Inu, the Elon Mars. You see a real developer like Charles Hoskinson sitting there because he's been doing his research. He's not rushing to get everything out there. They just stalled the Vassal hard fork on Cardano, and people are upset. But listen, he wants it perfected. If he did Ethereum with Vitalik, and Ethereum has an all-time high of almost $5,000, it started at several cents, then dollars, then it went to $700, then it went to $2,000, then it went to $4,000. There's time for growth. You're early into crypto. Do all your research, invest wisely, and I believe Cardano will definitely take Ethereum's spot, possibly Bitcoin. Just me thinking. You got to see the faces behind developers. Sick and tired of hearing the mystery stories of who developed it and they went missing. Like, it's all like a cartoon. This is your money, your investment. And when, maybe if you're a millennial, you like all these memes, and I mean, some of them are cute, they're fun, but we're talking about real money, real investments. And my name is Bobby, Crypto Granny, and people of my age are just getting into crypto, and we'll invest, but we need to know what we're investing in, and we need to avoid rug pulls. There's a guy named Upshot. He's an older gentleman. Everybody liked him. If you never heard of it, he opened up a YouTube page. He gained a beautiful, beautiful following from the Doge community. Then he made a crypto coin called Upshot or Upcoin, and he rug pulled on everybody. Everybody gained, they liked him. He gained their confidence. He did a rug pull. People like him need to go to jail, because if you rob somebody in real life with, if you just robbed them and took their money, you'd be in jail. The Wolf of Wall Street, same thing. People were doing things on Wall Street, they went to jail. Crypto is a real thing with real money, real investors, real families. We're not getting into this to be scammed. This is a real thing if you do your research. So yes, you can win. Will you win overnight? Most likely, no. Long term, absolutely, if you got the right projects. So please like, subscribe, follow my channel, and whenever you see me on live, I like to bring up a panel, ask me any questions. If there's anything you know and you can educate me, please come on the channel, and I appreciate you all. And we're here for educational purposes, and we all have to exchange information. Tell somebody to tell somebody about crypto. People are scared to get into it because there's no regulation. Now, we don't want to be regulated on what and how much we invest, because we're here to win, but we do need regulations as far as avoiding scams and all these fake overnight investors, developers rather, coming in and creating a coin instantaneously. There should be penalties and regulations. And to all the YouTubers who take money to shill a coin to their audience, God damn you. That's not fair. Just to put a few dollars in your pocket, you're getting millions and millions taken away from hardworking people. And this isn't just an American thing going on. It's worldwide. So it's real. If it wasn't real, Congress wouldn't be involved. Thank you all. Take care. God bless. And I will see you in about an hour or two. Please like, subscribe, and hit the notification. And jump on my next live and let's talk. Have a good afternoon, Crypto Granny, Bobby Bob. And thank you, Charles Hoskinson. You're doing very, very good things for the crypto community. A the gang, baby. Get your Cardanos. 2 for $1. Take care. God bless. And thank you for watching.